Hello and welcome to SEC Baseball Weekly here at Southeastern 16. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Graham Doty and Alfred Ezman join me. Today's show, we're going to make Graham explain the NCAA's new scholarship policy. We'll have Alfred update us on transfer portal, draft things, stuff like that. And then, of course, we'll always talk invitational tournaments. Seems like we got something every week to discuss. Before we get into that, a reminder, our content brought to you by BetOnline, the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything online sports betting. Right now, you can receive a 50% free bet of up to $250 on your first deposit to bet on anything from the Olympics to baseball to Formula One racing. BetOnline has every stat, every matchup, even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. When the game's over, head on over to our online casino, get in on a game of blackjack or poker, or unwind with over 150 slots games. Head to the website today, get in on the action, use promo code BELIEVE, that is BLEAV, for your 50% free bet credit on your first deposit up to $250. BetOnline, the game starts here. Well, we are doing this on Wednesday afternoon, the trade deadline for you Major League Baseball. I have to look at my watch. I can't remember what day it is anymore. The Major League Baseball trade deadline is in the rear view mirror as Alfred's Braves have been gutted. We've got the signing deadline about 24 hours away. So some of this content by the time it airs may be slightly dated. That's just the world we live in, and we'll wrap up any loose ends next week. But a lot is always happening in the portal. With signings, we had some surprises. I know, Alfred, we were chatting about one of those today. It was a really rare instance. So lots of stuff coming up today. But I think, Graham, the big talk in the college baseball world is expanded scholarship. Suddenly, 11.7. I know the podcast will have to maybe change its name after this. But that way in the rearview mirror, the NCAA just said, let's blow through that. We now have 34 scholarships, and I think everybody is trying to wrap their heads around that at the moment.
Yeah, they really are. Not just baseball, too. I mean, it's literally every sport on campus, football, all the way through. So here's what I would say. First of all, if you are unfamiliar or like actually want to read it and see the numbers and everything, Ross Dellinger has been all over this for Yahoo. I feel like he's really the only one covering in as much detail as anybody out there. So Ross is all over it. And then I got to learn a little bit more about it. So 2 weeks ago in the state of Mississippi, not all, but most of the broadcasters in the state of Mississippi got together in French Camp, Mississippi. And Ole Miss athletic director Keith Carter was the keynote speaker. And he spoke a little bit, but it quickly turned into like a Q&A type session. And all the questions were just about the future of collegiate sports and athletics. And the article from Ross had just come out at the time. So, from my understanding, just reading everything that Ross has written and listening to Keith Carter, who's literally been in the room with these conversations and everything with other athletic directors across the SEC and the country, let's take football, for example. You can have as many as 130 scholarships now for football, and every sport varies. And for whatever sport is on campus, you do not have to have the max amount of scholarships for that sport. As we know, baseball has always been at 11.7. That's it. There have been, some SEC schools and other schools across the country, you can get around with that in different ways. I feel like, Chris, you're very familiar with Vanderbilt. I feel like that's one of the most discussed things, since Corbin has been the head coach, just how Vandy handles their scholarship situations. You got Georgia with a Hope scholarship situation, Arkansas, I think they have border. If your state borders the state of Arkansas, that helps. If you're a program like Ole Miss and Mississippi State, Auburn and Alabama, most of the other schools in the SEC, you didn't have any help like that at all. It was just the 11.7. So now baseball has 34 is the max scholarships that you can give. You can't go higher than 34. Keith Carter was basically saying he doesn't think that Ole Miss or everybody else will go to that max, because if you go to a max in a sport, other sports on campus will not have as many scholarships to work with. Keith Carter was kind of saying that he kind of feels like the number for baseball is going to be 30 to 32, maybe 33, but that's kind of going to be the sweet spot. And so that means you're looking at 30 full ride scholarships in the sport of baseball. Basketball, the numbers has been 13 forever. Basketball for men's and women's is about to jump up to 15. And then softball, volleyball, soccer, you name it, they are about to get a lot of full ride scholarships as well. And again, it all kind of starts with football, biggest roster. That's why that conversation about walk-ons earlier this summer, I think with Kirby Smart, I think he started it. That was such a hot topic issue because everybody was wondering what the future of walk-ons and all the sports on campus would look like. And it's just kind of looking like you balance out all your full scholarships across all the sports, and walk-ons will still be a thing, but they'll get treated a little bit better moving forward too, as far as like, you don't have to pay your way for literally everything. So it was a lot. I mean, Keith Carter handled it very well. You got Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Southern Miss, you name it. Every school in the state is there peppering him with questions, and he just sat there and answered it. I mean, I thought he did a great job. I did learn it's not going to be called the Power Four moving forward. It's going to be called the Atomic Four for whatever reason. That's what they want to go with, the A4, since the Power Five is now dead.
That's very eerie. Like, I don't know what to make of that, but I like it. And it's interesting too, because the whole walk-on situation. I'm glad, for one thing, it's still kind of in the viewpoint, I guess, of college coaches. I'm not entirely sure what Kirby Smart had to say on it, but just in general, the idea of guys, working hard to come on and build themselves into a college program and be successful at it. It's just kind of what college sports are all about. So that's my biggest takeaway, at least, and it kind of off topic from baseball completely, but I guess still, because you have walk-ons in baseball as well. It's just you still have guys coming back and to go through the walk-on process, and if they're going to get treated better, that's even more encouraging for people to go through the process in general, because it used to be, for pretty much all the sports, just a chore, because playing a college sport in general is already a life commitment at that point. So it's good to see that that's still getting a lot of attention.
I want to ask you about the part where you said it might settle in at 30 to 32 instead of 34. Is that a Title IX thing?
It could be. I think when Title IX is, I mean, that's a huge question. And right now, when you ask about Title IX, the response is, I don't know. And I mean, that's everybody. That's athletic directors, presidents, coaches. This is a huge monumental shift. And this is only one part of it. The other part is still the NIL and all that stuff. And universities have to pay $20 to $25 million per year moving forward to everybody. So there's still so much in the air right now, and still so much uncertainty. Title IX being one of them. And when you ask about Title IX, the response you get is, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see if there's a little bit of a shell game between scholarships and NIL, because I mean, and that's what some schools are doing. They're just covering the cost of scholarships through NIL.
Right.
Now the accounting's different, and maybe that's money you can use to throw at players for paper play instead of just scholarships. But that's going to be an interesting dynamic too. I mean, I think eventually 10 years from now, it's going to be a different conversation. We'll have regulations and all kinds of stuff. But I do wonder if some of that's just going to be, okay, we can't do this, so we'll do that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then the other thing that sticks out to me, the SEC doesn't really have to worry about this. The SEC can handle the 30 to 32 scholarships. A lot of these other conferences are not going to be able to foot that bill, because that's a huge difference, and that's a lot of money that these universities will have to pay for moving forward. And then on top of that, if you have to pay your student athletes $20 to $25 million, the SEC doesn't have anything to worry about, but these other conferences certainly will.
I mean, you say, well, it may settle 30, 32. Really, the way college sports is working, like if we can get 100 and whatever in football, that nobody's going to leave those on the table. I mean, you look around the baseball universe, everybody's improving facilities. The bidding wars for NIL and baseball are getting super competitive. You're hearing, 7 figures sometimes. I'm not sure I believe that, but I do believe, 500,000 price tag for a superstar for sure, if not more. I mean, I just question how much opportunity we're going to leave on the table at any of these schools. I mean, Missouri might be the one exception, but everybody else in baseball's all in.
They really are. And you mentioned 7 figures. We just saw it last week in the sport of softball. Texas Tech got the National Player of the Year in softball, and she's making over $1 million for softball. How much time is it going to take before that starts to become something that happens in the baseball world, especially in the SEC? If Paul Skeens isn't worth $1 million, who's worth $1 million?
Skeens was allegedly $250,000, but that's 2 years ago, and that might as well be 20 years ago at this point. So
exactly. And that was money well spent for LSU, by the way. I'd say it worked out.
Yeah.
It worked out very well. Now, the scholarship thing is going to be – because everybody's always had different rules. Vanderbilt's always been on one end. That's one that people said, well, the scholarship. But the flip side of that is Vanderbilt's tuition and fees, they're $90,000 a year. So even if you get a half scholarship with part of that covered out of financial aid, you're still shelling out $45,000 a year. Do it over 3 years, that's $135,000. I mean, I know they've had players on that roster that have been key cogs in national title teams that paid 6 figures to go to school there. That's on one end because the tuition price is different. Now, the state schools are going to be more similar in pricing, but it's that out-of-state tuition component that makes it interesting at a lot of places. It's not – I don't think it's easy for anybody to go to out-of-state in any SEC market right now, unless you've got a reciprocity agreement with the county on the border. But, I mean, and then you had on the other end, you always had – I think Alabama and Mississippi are not lottery states, correct?
Correct.
So, like I know in Tennessee where I am, you got that lottery bonus too, and the threshold wasn't that high. Now, if you're going – depends on where you're going. If you're going to Tennessee, that puts a lot more dent in the sticker price than it does Vanderbilt if you're in state. But point is, even on both ends of the spectrum of discussion, that's always been an uneven bar because it's always going to depend on your tuition and your state lottery laws.
Yeah, it really does. And that's why, like, Arkansas, like, they've always been good under Van Horn, but I feel like they made a huge step lately because of their border. I mean, they touch a lot of states that produce a lot of really good baseball talent. And I mean, if you have an offer from Ole Miss or Mississippi State and Arkansas, and you get a little bit more money and it's a little cheaper to go to Arkansas, I mean, why would you not consider going to Fayetteville? So I mean, it's about to move and just be so different. It's already changed from 2-3 years ago, post-COVID. I can't imagine what it's going to look like 2 years from now.
Yeah. Any parting thoughts on the scholarship situation before we get into player movement?
You got anything, Alfred?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting. The story about that softball player is really interesting, too. I think it shows how fast we're changing. I mean, I looked this up when I saw that. There are a few $1 million plus softball programs in the country. Tennessee's one of them. Oklahoma's definitely one of them. And there's a few others on that list. I think Florida's up there as well. But the average a softball program brings in is like $700,000. And this girl, God bless her, and thank goodness it's getting this kind of money, but she's making more than what the majority of softball programs make just for existing. So it's crazy to think how that's changing. I wonder how, I don't know if there's any causation, correlation, or anything like that to it, but it's interesting to see how that's kind of gonna, I don't know, like change the landscape of these smaller sports that don't necessarily have a lot of revenue, because baseball, compared to basketball and football, is very well in that category too. So I don't know. It's a little bit off from, I guess, the amount of scholarships these schools are getting, but it just goes to show it's changing fast, and there's going to be a lot of adjustments, I think, for the next decade, like Chris said.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see how the scholarships, Graham, affect the schools that can't afford to offer 30-something scholarships. Because, I mean, on one hand, there's going to be a rich get richer, but on the other hand, here's something I meant to bring up before we move on. That 34 limit is a pretty hard limit too, isn't it? You can't
Right.
like roster 15 guys, off the roster anymore, like a lot of teams have been able with injuries and stuff. I think there's going to be some limitations. And by the way, I'll get a guest on in a week or two that'll go over this in more detail. I've got somebody in mind, but I think that's going to be a factor that changes too, is it not?
Yeah, that'll definitely be a factor. What all this conversation, all it does, what really sticks out in my mind, if you are not a fan of college baseball being regional, get ready, because the SEC and the ACC, maybe a couple Big 12 schools, that's all you're about to see in the regionals and super regionals.
Yeah, that part I don't like. You could have, I don't know, UCLA or USC or somebody, or maybe a place like Nebraska where they love their baseball, decide, hey, we'll go more towards the full cap, and then the parity in those leagues is going to get ugly in a hurry, which I think it was about to anyway.
You got to remember, though, the California schools and Oregon and Washington, they've had good baseball programs in the past. They're in the Big Ten now. So,
Yeah,
like, how big of an adjustment is that for them? The Big Ten style of baseball is totally different than the Pac-12. Nobody plays small ball in the Big Ten. So it'll be an adjustment period style of play for sure, but then also the scholarships. The Big Ten could do it. They can handle it. Just because all those universities are so massive with their enrollment and everything, but they just don't care about college baseball. And a big reason why is just the weather. It's just so hard to cooperate. I mean, Ole Miss has played a Big Ten team 5 years in a row now, and Ole Miss has won every single one of those series.
and some good teams too, like Iowa last year.
Yeah, Iowa. I think they had a first round draft pick as a pitcher, and
Brody Brecht.
Yeah, and I mean, Ole Miss was able to get to him and handle him, and Ole Miss took that series. But Ole Miss has played Maryland, Purdue, Illinois, somebody else. So Ole Miss has enjoyed playing those Big Ten teams early.
Yeah, I'm thinking what you're going to see is a balance of power shift. I was thinking directly the Big Ten, because you're going to see maybe a UCLA or an Oregon say, hey, we're going to go more towards that, and a Rutgers or somebody say, hey, maybe not. But moving along, player movement. Alfred, we had some big storylines in player movement, including one that broke in Lexington today.
Yeah, a huge one in Lexington today. The Rays did not only get gutted from the deadline, they also got a miniature gut punch today from one of their draftees. Tyler Bell was picked by them early on in the draft. Huge high school prospect going to Kentucky, or was committed to Kentucky. He's now going to Kentucky after today. As everyone knows now at this point, draftees, their deadline to choose whether they go to the MLB or the professional level or college is tomorrow, August 1st, as we're recording this. So there's going to be more of these stories that pop out, and that's most of what I saw. But Bell is going to Kentucky. And just before I get into the other returnees, just to touch on Kentucky, I feel like we haven't touched on them as much during this portal, but they're doing just as good as anybody. I mean, we use 64 analytics. They're 10th overall on 64 analytics, and it's not necessarily because they got a lot of top end guys in the portal, but they just got a lot of guys in the portal. They have a large portal class that has just a ton of experimental projects Mangione can work with. Dylan Koontz, a talented hitter from Campbell's one. Luke Lawrence, another good hitter from Illinois State. And then Oliver Boone, who's a really young pitcher from Cal, who, was really good over there in Berkeley in relief this past season. I think this goes to show how good and how much Mangione's changed this program. I mean, I can't remember this. Obviously, this style of transfer portal is new to everybody, but this is probably, I would say, Kentucky's best it's had so far for baseball. And on top of that, I mean, they get a kid who was picked high in the draft compared to others. And he comes back and decides to play college baseball in Lexington over, going professional, which is weird because that slot value was probably pretty high for whatever pick he was at. So good for the Cats. Big stuff. We haven't touched on them as much this offseason so far, but they're doing big things and they'll be a threat again this next season. The next one, Mac Rose for Vandy, a JUCO transfer coming into Vandy. I think he was picked by the Rangers during the draft, but is deciding to come to Vandy and play. It's a huge pickup for the Commodores, who, Chris, you can touch on them too once I finish up. But, obviously they want to bring in as much as they can to keep their momentum high with all these SEC teams just starting to get more and more powerful through the portal and by ways of recruiting and stuff. So a good pickup for the Doors. And then Florida lands a big return in Colby Shelton, one of the more prominent bats in that lineup from a season ago. He's back in there, combined with the portal class Florida's bringing in. You got to like what Kevin O'Sullivan's doing down there, and getting an experienced guy in the program like Shelton is a huge up for them as well. And then I'm just going to touch on these are two other teams who I feel like we haven't touched on, or I haven't touched on at least as much in the portal. It's the two Alabama squads. I'll start with the Tide. They come in ranked 12th in 64 analytics. They got some good strikeout pitching in transfers like Packy Bradley Cooney out of Campbell, and then Carson Osmer from Penn. I think I said that right. Yeah, Osmer. So good pitching for the Tide, who obviously they had Ben Hesco pretty high in this past draft. They want to retain some pitching coming back. Zane Adams is a big pitcher coming back for the Tide. He was pretty good this past season. So I don't know, later on as we get closer to 2025, we'll do, position rankings. And once we get the pitchers, Zane Adams will be a guy that's pretty high on my list to watch out for in this league. So the pitching in Tuscaloosa is looking pretty good. And then they got an interesting SEC name coming to Tuscaloosa as well. Brady Neal transferring from LSU to Tuscaloosa. Their other catcher, Gassetti, I believe he got or he signed with the Braves post-draft, I think. So, and I don't know, I haven't heard anything as far as him coming back to Alabama or not, or if he has any eligibility left. But Brady Neal is a good replacement. If that doesn't happen, Neal was the backup catcher for Milazzo most of the year in Baton Rouge. So a good pickup there for the Tide. And then Justin Torres is a really good hitter from Miami. And he comes into Alabama as well. Again, Alabama's a team who kind of has flown under the radar, did last year a little bit, but they have a lot of talent coming back. And a lot of talent in this portal. I mean, it's, the 12th ranked class is nothing to sneeze at all. So good for them. And then moving on to, we're going to go to Auburn. Oh, we talked about Auburn a little bit, but it's more so Auburn getting rid of guys. Chris Stanfield obviously transferring out of there. We did talk about them getting Cade Fisher, which is, the obvious biggest story in this portal as of recent, at least for the Tigers. But they get other guys as well. Jet Johnston is a name Texas A&M fans will know. Did not get a lot of playing time at all in College Station, but Auburn, I would imagine, is a place where he can really show what he's made of there. So that's an SEC name going to the Tigers. And then Sam Dutton, the LSU relief pitcher, is heading to Auburn as well. He has some starter experience as well. I'm not sure Auburn fans, if they're watching, can enlighten me more, but based on Auburn's starter situation, Dutton could possibly work into a starting role for the Tigers this offseason if needed, because he has that experience to him. So there wasn't as much, I guess the takeaways I have before handing it off. The main stories we've been getting is just people coming back, because that deadline for draftees is August 1st tomorrow as we're recording this. And I'm just highlighted a few teams in the portal we haven't touched on as much, because it just goes to show there's a ton of SEC teams at the top, and it's only going to continue as there's a little more time left to kind of get these guys to come back.
Yeah, I think let's start with Kentucky. There's a lot of stuff I want to touch on across several teams, but Graham, the slot value for that pick was $1.25 million. I don't know if that's an NIL situation, and maybe they've got a little something to work with there. I mean, Nick Mingione has been killing it in the transfer market anyway. Yeah. Now he's got Omaha under his belt for the first time in that program history. I mean, that's a shocker. I would say when a guy goes in that range of the draft, you got a maybe 1 in 500 chance of getting him through the draft. I mean, it's hard to get a guy top 10 rounds through the draft,
Right.
much less a guy that's got a slot value of $1.25 million.
Only thing I can think of, injury issues, which I don't think there is with him. And then also if they just did not want to give him a lot of money, who knows what they gave to other guys in different slots, but nonetheless, that is a huge get for Kentucky. And just the job that Mingione has done, 2 years ago, Super Regional Omaha for the first time ever this past season. So he is definitely, building something, and he's got stability. I mean, you got to think that he'll get a nice raise, and he seems to be happy in Lexington. And I know he's going to be very loyal to the Wildcats as well, because they gave him an opportunity. Not only did they give him an opportunity, Chris, but they stuck with him. I mean, Kentucky did not take off immediately. Like, it took a little bit for him to get going and to build it. So future's definitely bright for the Wildcats, no doubt.
Yeah, my first thought is that's a spot where Tampa got caught having to overslot guys later in the draft. I'm looking on MLB.com. I'm not seeing it. They signed several guys under slot in the first round. Theo Gillen, their first rounder, went right at slot. Emilian Petre. Boy, they really rated Kentucky. They took Petre, who did sign, their second baseman, and they took two of Kentucky's three starters in Dominic Neiman and Trey Poozer later in the draft. Poozer signed under slot, and Neiman was one of those 11 to 20 guys, and I think the max they can sign for is 150. So, no, I can't see where this is a deal where Tampa had just, committed money elsewhere and had to maybe go under slot on Tyler Bell, which makes it all the more impressive that Nick Mingione has done what he's done. But let's see, a couple other things. Colby Shelton returning to Florida. Remember when he got picked, I don't know, maybe 6 guys from the end when there were 40 of SEC guys. In fact, there were about 4 guys in those last 6 picks that we have talked about or are going to talk about on this show, which is highly unusual. But Colby Shelton was one of those that said, all right, look out. They could save some money elsewhere and throw a bag of cash at him. But Colby Shelton coming back to Florida, where frankly, and if I'm Colby Shelton, he didn't have a Colby Shelton type year that we were expecting, Graham. I think that's a kid that might have said, hey, I come back and do what I think I can do playing a second year at shortstop, because remember, he was a third baseman in Alabama. Maybe that went into some of the thinking there.
No doubt. And I mean, he's definitely going to play, and just if he has another big year, which he's definitely capable of doing, he's going to be sitting very pretty, by the time the draft rolls around. So another good get for the Gators. And, Coach O'Sullivan always seems to have talent, and they just reload as always, it seems like, in Gainesville.
Alfred, you hit on 2 Alabama schools. Let's start with Alabama first. And you mentioned it. They've done a great job in the transfer portal. Remember last year that roster got raided after the coaching change, and they hit some guys in the portal after losing their, probably their best returning starter to LSU. But Walton's kind of a pitching guy, but not only has he had some arms, but, Justin Torres, Brady Neal. Neal's a guy that 2 years ago was a guy that LSU was probably a little fortunate to get through the draft, and maybe the bat's ahead of the defense. I'm going to gather. I'm not down there watching practice, but just based on, I thought Brady Neal would have gotten more of a shot to play in Baton Rouge last year. So that's a name that 2 years ago, LSU got some names through the draft the last couple of years. That's one now. I'm interested to see what he does in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, and I think, Alabama has been kind of not even in my viewpoint during this portal, and it's nothing. I think it's just been quiet. They've just quietly been making moves, and I haven't really noticed and whatnot. But that's a team. You got to think, like you said, Chris. Around 2 years ago, that program was in turmoil, to say the least, with what was going on, and now they're turning it around. And they had a quick exit in the tournament. They also played in Tallahassee, which is tough to begin with in the regional, so you can't really fault them there considering what they had going on. But they attacked this portal well. They're right outside of the top 10. I mentioned Zane Adams pitching, but another returner they'll have is Justin LeBron. And I loved what he showed late in the year at short. He's going to be a big name this next season in the SEC. And they're going to be a fun team to watch. Obviously, just because of how talented this league is, it's hard for me to put them in the top 5 now this early looking back. But they're a team that can make a run towards the top of the league and be competitive with pretty much everybody. And that's a good thing Alabama's done, and they'll continue to do. And I mean, they'll be waiting. They had quite a handful of guys get picked beyond Ben Hess in this draft. So we'll have to wait and see come tomorrow if they return or not. But so far, job well done in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, last one here. You mentioned Mac Rose's commitment to Vanderbilt. He is Mr. Irrelevant for this draft. Last guy taken, JUCO catcher who had spent a year at McLennan, Texas, which is that's one of the better JUCOs around. Vanderbilt needed some depth at catcher.
Mm-hmm.
Alan Espinal got drafted, I want to say, by the Rockies. So they've got a vacancy there. They'll go probably he and Colin Barzey, who was doing some DH work at that catching spot. But that's one he hit pretty well last year and got drafted by the Rangers, which are his hometown team. But apparently he's going to head to Vanderbilt where he will have opportunity next year. So,
yeah. It's huge for them too. Looking at Vandy's transfer class as well, it's not the biggest of classes, so he's going to have some opportunity to go in there and put some work in and stuff. And I mean, that's a Vanderbilt team with Tim Corbin. Chris, you could tell it better than anybody, any of us here, and pretty much anybody. They're looking to end up better than where they ended a year ago, because I was in Clemson for that whole fiasco.
Ugly.
Yeah, for that fiasco to put tournament, and it was a very sour taste. And I caught up with Espinal and Corbin after. It was a very sour taste in their mouths, as they were talking to media after and stuff. So it's a motivated program, and to say to look at the transfer class and say, well, Vanderbilt's not attacking or getting guys in bunches is just shows that's not what you have to look at. You just got to trust what Tim Corbin's doing. And Mac Rose has a good chance to really come through here with the people coming back to Vandy, and you can't count them out, just to say the least. And he's a huge bat that they get coming back there.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see where they settle when all the signings are done and I look at everybody's roster. I thought that they were poised to be maybe a top 5, top 10 national team next year until the Zierwer kid went back to Michigan State. That was a big blow. He would have been a weekend arm, and he's a guy that you could see in the first round next year. Now, Vanderbilt still got pitching talent, but that would have been an ace-level guy for them. So take him off, add in Mac Rose. It's not an equal swap, but it does help a little bit. I'll be very curious to see where they land. It's not a place where Tim Corbin had his program 3 or 4 years ago. They haven't gotten, out of a regional since they went to the College World Series final in 2021. So weird place for them to be. They did get some good guys in the portal, but hey, so did most of the league. So anyway, it is time to talk tournaments. Seems like we get one of these every week. Alfred, what has been booked since we last had a show?
Yeah, these have been out for quite some time now, but with the whole, MLB draft, more portal stuff, scholarships, it's kind of flown over our heads a little, but some big tournaments and some cool places. Texas is headed to Las Vegas for the Las Vegas College Baseball Classic. It's the A's AAA affiliate, I believe. That's the ballpark they're playing in Vegas. It's a good field as well. I mean, Texas will face Texas Tech, Washington, and Illinois March 1st through the 3rd. Just looking down that list, Illinois, when you compare them to other Big Ten teams, they had a pretty good team this year. I watched them a good bit when they came to Knoxville and played Tennessee. Pretty competitive for a Big Ten school and stuff like that. Washington as well usually puts some great teams together. Texas Tech is a good baseball program. They've produced a lot of good players as well. It's talented. I think, looking at it just straight up, Texas is a good shot to really make a statement early in the year and, sweep their way through that if they can. So big start. It would be a big start for Schlossnagle and the Longhorns if they're able to do that. And then one more. Speaking of the Tide, this is a Crimson Tide episode. Alabama is going to Jacksonville for the Jacksonville Baseball Classic. That's early in the season, February 21st through the 23rd. I like this field a lot. It's NC State, Coastal, Carolina, and then Ohio State. Ohio State had a lot of talent coming out of the portal. Part of that was because of their coaching situation. Graham, you talked with me about that a little, but they had a lot of talent coming out of the portal and whatnot. If you're a college baseball fan whatsoever, you know about Coastal Carolina and their run they had in 2016 to a national title. That still, kind of lingers for people. And I would imagine, I like the Sun Belt schools a lot with, the style of ball they play and stuff. They give teams a run for their money, no matter who they are most of the time. And then NC State, of course. I mean, NC State was in Omaha this past season, and you have to imagine that's a good challenge for the Tide as well. But again, Alabama in the Jacksonville Baseball Classic, February 21st to the 23rd against Ohio State, Coastal, and NC State. 2 good fields and 2 more SEC teams who get to stack up with the rest of the country early on in some neutral sites.
Who have we got left? What fields have not been set off the top of your head, Graham?
I'm just thinking of the Texas tournaments are set.
Both the Texas ones are there.
Mm-hmm.
There's one in Minneapolis has one every year, I think. I don't know if that one's been set, or at least it used to.
Yeah, Ole Miss was in that, I think, 2 years ago. Ole Miss has played in that twice within the past decade.
That's a weird event.
Well, it used before Target Field, before that was built, it was the Dome, and Ole Miss played in that tournament in the Dome, and their policy is you have to have X number of people before we can cut the heat or AC on. And so for college baseball, you're not going to hit that number, and it's either ice cold in there or it's on fire. That's what I remember about that tournament.
Oh my goodness. Well, plenty of off-season news going. We'll talk more about the scholarship thing. This time next week, we'll have more of a wrap on the draft, maybe do some winners and losers with the big picture in mind. But gentlemen, enjoyed it. Alfred, sorry about your raise, but that's life in Major League Baseball. I'm sure you guys will be fine one day.
Yes, hopefully.
Yeah, you got some prospects. That's how you sleep at night.
Right.
So, all right. For Alfred Ezman and Graham Doty, I'm Chris Lee. You're watching SEC Baseball Weekly here at Southeastern 16.